The sun was a hammer, beating down on the cracked earth until the heat rose in shimmering waves, distorting the horizon into a watery mirage. Leanne ran, the fine silk of her red cheongsam clinging to her skin, its vibrant color a defiant wound against the endless brown and ochre of the landscape. Each labored breath was a fire in her lungs. The intricate embroidery, phoenixes and peonies meant for a life of gilded captivity, now snagged on sagebrush and thorns, unraveling thread by precious thread. She had been running for what felt like an eternity, fueled by a terror so profound it had burned away tears, leaving only a hollow ache in her chest. The man she was fleeing was not a man, but a cage made of wealth and expectation. Mr. Finch. His name tasted like ash in her mouth. He had paid for her, shipped her like fine porcelain, and expected her to be grateful for the shelf upon which he would display her. But she was not porcelain. She was flesh and bone and a will that had finally, terrifyingly, broken free. Her delicate slippers, meant for carpeted floors, were shredded. The soles of her feet were blistered and bleeding, each step a fresh agony. The world began to tilt, the brutal sun pressing down, down, down. A distant fence line wavered in her vision, a thin, man-made scratch on an unforgiving canvas. Beyond it, a small, solid cabin sat stubbornly under a lone cottonwood tree, a refuge she knew she would never reach. Her strength gave out in a single, final surrender. The world dissolved into a dizzying swirl of red silk and brown dust as she fell, the unforgiving earth rising up to claim her. Samuel saw the flash of red first, a jarring splash of color against the muted tones of his land. He'd been mending a stretch of fence, the familiar rhythm of his work a comfort against the solitude that was both his curse and his shield. He straightened up, wiping sweat from his brow with the back of a leather glove. His eyes narrowed against the glare. It wasn't a fire, and it wasn't a sunset flower. It was a person, lying still and broken near his property line. Caution was a habit etched deep into his bones, a lesson learned from a past that had taught him to expect the worst of people. He approached slowly, his hand resting near the handle of the hammer on his belt. As he drew closer, the shape resolved itself into a woman, impossibly dressed for this harsh country. She was lying face down, a spill of crimson silk and black hair against the thirsty ground. He knelt, his movements careful, and gently turned her over. Her face was pale, streaked with dirt and tears, her lips cracked and dry. She was so slight, she looked as though a strong gust could carry her away. He saw the state of her feet, the ruin of her fine clothes, and the story they told was one of desperation. This was not a threat. This was trouble, yes, but the kind a decent man could not turn his back on. With a sigh that seemed to carry the weight of years, he carefully scooped her into his arms. She was lighter than a sack of feed. Her head lolled against his shoulder, a faint, feverish breath ghosting against his neck. He carried her toward the cool shadow of his cabin, his long, steady strides eating up the ground that had defeated her. She awoke to stillness and the scent of pine wood and soap. For a terrifying moment, she didn't know where she was. Panic seized her, a cold fist clenching in her stomach. She tried to sit up, but a wave of dizziness pushed her back down onto a simple cot. The room was sparse, masculine, and scrupulously clean. A stone fireplace stood cold against one wall, and a single window looked out onto a sun-bleached porch. A man sat in a chair by that window, his back to her, mending a piece of leather tack. He was large and broad-shouldered, and the silence he occupied felt vast and absolute. He must have heard her stir because he stopped his work and turned his head. His face was weathered by the sun, his eyes a startlingly clear gray, and they held no malice, only a quiet, watchful curiosity. He rose from his chair, his movements economical and slow, as if not to frighten a wild thing. He approached the cot and held out a tin cup of water. "You were out in the sun," he said. His voice was low and rough, like stones rubbing together, a voice unused to frequent speech. Leanne flinched away from the cup, her mind screaming at her to trust no one, especially not a strange man in a remote cabin. He seemed to understand. He didn't press, but simply placed the cup on the small crate beside the cot and retreated to his chair. He picked up his leatherwork again, the rhythmic pass of the needle through the hide becoming the only sound in the room. His patience was a balm. Slowly, cautiously, she reached for the cup. The water was cool and clean, the most wonderful thing she had ever tasted. She drank it all, the simple act of kindness from this silent man, a fragile crack in the wall of her fear. Days bled into one another in a haze of healing and quiet observation. Samuel, she learned his name was Samuel, never pressed her for her story. He would leave food for her on the crate, simple meals of beans and cured meat and hard bread, and then retreat outside to his endless chores. He gave her space, a commodity more precious than gold. He treated her not as an oddity or a burden, but with a respectful distance that slowly soothed her frayed nerves. The terror began to recede, replaced by a profound sense of obligation. She was a guest in his home, using his resources, and she had nothing to offer. The shame of it was a constant, low hum beneath the surface of her gratitude. One afternoon, she felt strong enough to stand and walk around the small cabin. His life was laid bare in its simplicity, a well-kept rifle over the mantel, a short shelf of worn books, a neatly made bed. There was no clutter, no softness, nothing of a woman's touch. It was the home of a man who was utterly alone. That evening, when he came inside smelling of dust and horses, she stood waiting for him, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. The red dress, now washed and crudely mended, felt like a costume she could not shed. "Sir," she began, her voice barely a whisper. He stopped, surprised to see her up and addressing him. He simply nodded, waiting. I have no way to repay you for your kindness." Her gaze fell to the floor. "Let me cook for you," she whispered, the words rushing out before she could lose her nerve. "I owe you that." He looked at her, his gray eyes unreadable. He seemed to consider it, his gaze moving from her earnest face to his own plain larder. After a long moment, he gave another short, single nod. It was all the permission she needed. The first meal she made was simple, but it transformed the cabin. Using the meager ingredients he had, onions, potatoes, a little flour, some herbs she found growing wild near the creek, she created a fragrant stew and a batch of soft, fluffy flatbreads. The aroma filled the small space, chasing away the lingering sense of leather and solitude. When Samuel came in from the barn that evening, he stopped dead in the doorway, his expression one of stunned surprise. The room was warm, filled with the glow of the lamp and the smell of a real meal. For the first time, he saw her not as a refugee or a problem, but as a woman standing by his hearth, a faint sheen of perspiration on her brow, a smudge of flour on her cheek. They ate in their usual silence, but it was a different kind of silence now. It was no longer empty, but filled with the companionable sounds of eating, the soft clink of spoons against bowls. The stew was rich and deeply flavorful, unlike anything he had ever cooked for himself. He ate a second helping, and when he was done, he looked at her across the table. "It was good," he said, the two words carrying the weight of a whole speech. That praise, so plainly given, was like sunshine on a long dormant seed. From that day on, the kitchen became her domain. She found a rhythm in the chopping and stirring, a purpose in nourishing the man who had saved her. Over shared meals, words began to come more easily. She told him her name was Leanne. She told him of the village she came from, a place of green hills and winding rivers, so different from this stark, beautiful land. And one evening, her voice trembling, she told him about Mr. Finch, the wealthy merchant in the town of Redemption, who believed he owned her. Samuel listened without interruption, his face a stoic mask. But she saw the tightening of his jaw, the way his hands, resting on the table, curled slightly into fists. He did not offer platitudes or false assurances. He simply listened, his quiet presence a testament of belief. When she finished, her story hanging in the air between them like smoke, he finally spoke. "He will not find you here," he said. It was not a promise of violence, but a statement of fact. His home was her sanctuary. The knowledge settled deep inside her, a feeling of safety so profound it almost made her weep. She began to see the man behind the silence. She saw the gentleness in the way he handled a newborn calf, the patience he showed a stubborn horse. She saw the deep lines of a past sorrow etched around his eyes. He never spoke of his own life, of why a man so capable and decent lived in such isolation, but his wounds were visible in his guardedness. In turn, he saw the strength and resilience beneath her delicate exterior. He watched her hands, once soft, become competent with kitchen knives and mending needles. She repaired the tear in his best shirt with stitches so fine they were nearly invisible. He found one of her ruined slippers one day, its sole completely gone. He took it to his workshop without a word and, using a supple piece of new leather, painstakingly crafted a replacement, stitching it with the same care he gave his finest harnesses. He left the repaired shoe by her cot. She found it that evening, her heart swelling with an emotion she did not dare name. It was more than gratitude. It was a tender, fragile thing, growing in the quiet spaces between them. What do you think will happen when her past finally catches up to her? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. The fragile peace of their existence was shattered one blistering afternoon. A plume of dust on the horizon signaled an approaching rider, an uncommon event that set an immediate edge in the air. Samuel was sharpening an axe blade, the rhythmic scrape of stone on steel a familiar sound. He stopped, his head lifting, his entire body going still as he watched the rider draw closer. Leanne was hanging laundry on a line she had strung between the cabin and the cottonwood tree, the plain work shirts and trousers a stark contrast to the memory of her red dress. She saw the look on Samuel's face and her blood ran cold. She knew, with a certainty that defied logic, who it was. The rider was Mr. Finch. He rode a magnificent black horse and was dressed in a fine city suit, both looking absurdly out of place. He dismounted with an air of arrogant ownership, his eyes scanning the property with a dismissive sneer before they landed on Leanne. A cruel smile spread across his face. "There you are," he said, his voice smooth and proprietary. "I must admit, you gave me quite the chase, my dear. Did you really think you could hide in a hovel like this?" He took a step toward her, but Samuel moved to stand between them, the axe still held loosely in his hand. Samuel was not a tall man, but he seemed to have the rootedness of an ancient tree. His presence was a solid, unmovable wall. Finch's eyes flickered to Samuel, taking in his worn clothes and calloused hands. "And who is this? Your rustic protector? He scoffed. Step aside, farmer. This is a private matter. The girl is my property. I have the papers to prove it. She is not property, Samuel said, his voice dangerously quiet. She is a person, and she is under my protection. Finch laughed, a short, ugly sound. Protection? You have nothing. I am a respected man in Redemption. I have business with the bank, the railroad. Who are you? A reclusive nobody with a patch of dirt? The law is on my side. The sheriff will see it my way. He turned his venomous gaze back to Leanne, who stood trembling behind Samuel. You will come with me now, Leanne. We can forget this foolishness. Do not make this more unpleasant than it needs to be. Leanne's heart hammered against her ribs. The safety she had found here felt like a dream evaporating in the harsh light of reality. Finch was everything she feared: power, entitlement, and a cruelty masked by a veneer of civility. He saw her only as an object he had purchased, a beautiful thing to be possessed. But as she looked at Samuel's back, at the steady set of his shoulders, a flicker of defiance sparked within her. The fear was still there, a cold snake in her gut, but it was no longer all-consuming. She had known kindness here. She had known respect. She would not go back to being a thing in a cage. I will not go with you, she said, her voice shaking but clear. Finch's face darkened with rage. You ungrateful wretch! After all I have done for you! He took another aggressive step forward, his hand reaching for her. In a blur of motion, Samuel shifted his stance, placing the head of the axe on the ground between them. He didn't raise it as a weapon. He simply planted it there, a line drawn in the dust. The message was unmistakable. You will leave my land, Samuel said, his voice flat and cold as iron. Now. The confrontation moved, as Finch had predicted, to town. He had ridden straight to Sheriff Brody, spinning a tale of a runaway ward and a brutish farmer who was holding her against her will. The next day, Sheriff Brody rode out to the ranch himself. He was a fair man, and he listened patiently as Samuel explained the situation in his simple, direct way. He looked at Leanne, saw the fear in her eyes, but also the resolve, and he knew this was more complicated than a simple property dispute. He decreed they would all meet in his office the following morning to settle it. The town of Redemption was buzzing with the story. When Samuel and Leanne arrived, they were met with stares and whispers. Finch was already there, pacing in front of the sheriff's office, looking confident and righteous. He had dressed for the occasion, presenting himself as the wronged party, a civilized man dealing with frontier lawlessness. The office was small and crowded. Sheriff Brody sat behind his desk, his face grim. Finch began, his voice dripping with condescension, presenting his papers, speaking of contracts and investments. He painted Leanne as a flighty, ungrateful girl and Samuel as a backwoods brute who had preyed upon her. Through it all, Samuel stood silently beside Leanne, his presence a quiet anchor in the storm of accusations. When Finch was finished, Sheriff Brody turned to Samuel. Well, what do you have to say for yourself, man? All eyes were on him. The silent rancher, the man nobody really knew. He took a breath, and when he spoke, his voice was not loud, but it filled the room with its absolute certainty. Mr. Finch speaks of papers and contracts, Samuel said, his gaze steady. He speaks of her as if she were a horse he bought at a sale. He says he owns her. But a man cannot own another person's heart. He cannot own her will. He turned his head slightly to look at Leanne, his expression softening for a fraction of a second. She came to my home in fear for her life. She was given shelter. That is all. The only question that matters is not what his papers say, but what she wants. You need to ask her. He fell silent. The simplicity and moral clarity of his words stunned the room. He hadn't defended his own actions. He had defended her humanity. Sheriff Brody looked at Finch, then at Samuel, and finally his gaze settled on Leanne. "Ma'am," he asked gently, "what is it you want?" Leanne stood tall, and for the first time she met Finch's gaze without flinching. "I want to be free," she said, her voice clear and strong. "I do not belong to him. I choose to stay with Mr. Samuel." The sheriff nodded slowly, a final judgment settling on his face. He turned to a furious Finch. "The lady has made her choice. This is not a matter of property. It's over. Now get out of my town." The ride back to the ranch was quiet, but the silence was different yet again. It was a silence of relief, of a shared victory. The tension that had been a constant companion for weeks had finally broken, leaving a profound and peaceful calm in its wake. The sun was beginning to set as they reached the cabin, casting long shadows and painting the sky in hues of soft pink and orange. That evening, Leanne made a simple dinner. She no longer wore the mended red dress, which she had folded away and put in a chest. She wore a plain dress of blue cotton she had sewn herself from fabric Samuel had bought her on his last trip to town for supplies. It was the dress of a woman who belonged to the land, not one on display. They ate on the porch, watching the last of the light fade from the sky. The air was cool and smelled of dust and dry grass. For a long time, neither of them spoke. Then Samuel cleared his throat. "I never told you," he began, his voice hesitant, "why I live out here alone." Leanne waited, giving him the same patient silence he had always given her. "My wife, she died. A fever, 5 years ago. This place, it was our dream. After she was gone, the silence got so loud. I guess I just got used to it." He looked at his hands, turning them over as if seeing them for the first time. "It's not so loud anymore. Not since you came." Leanne's heart ached with a sweet, piercing tenderness. She reached across the small space between their chairs and gently placed her hand over his. His skin was rough, calloused from years of hard labor, but his touch was warm and steady. He turned his hand over and laced his fingers through hers. It was a simple gesture, but it held all the promises of a shared future. It spoke of companionship, of healing, of two solitary souls finding a home in one another. They sat there for a long time as the stars began to appear, their hands clasped together, the quiet cabin behind them no longer just a shelter, but a home.